You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you something special, a bonus episode we're calling Museum Spotlight. It's a chance for you to hear more about what's happening at the National Law Enforcement Museum, who's involved in bringing this operation to life, and maybe some ways you can be involved. Let's start off at the top and chat with the museum's executive director, Thomas Canavan. Thomas, I know you have got a non-stop schedule, so thanks for taking some time to sit down for the podcast today.
Thanks, Charles. Happy to be here.
So, how long have you been with the museum?
I've been here since December 2019.
Thomas, on some of our other podcasts, we've heard about other parts of our larger organization. Can you share with us a bit more about how the museum fits into the larger organizational structure?
Yep. So the museum exists to tell the story of American law enforcement. So within the three pillars, we honor the fallen at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, and we work to keep names off the wall through officer safety and wellness. And the third pillar, the National Law Enforcement Museum, is here to tell those stories of American law enforcement in the past and through today. So we have a lot of opportunity to really bring to the American public, but the world at large, stories from within law enforcement that a lot of times the general public doesn't get an opportunity to hear.
When you joined the organization, I'm curious, what surprised you most about the museum?
So within the museum, I think I was really impressed with how well the museum pulls together a really traditional museum experience by having very high quality permanent exhibitions with a wide range of artifacts from the entire history of law enforcement, and pulling together the experiential, interactive, hands-on, high-tech experiences within a museum that audience have come to want within a museum experience. So to have both of those done so well within the design and construction of this museum was very impressive.
Yeah, it's the space for listeners who have not been able to visit the museum in person. It's a really neat space. It's used very well. It's creatively designed. And I'm going to ask you for a couple favorites now. I would love to hear what your favorite space in the museum is, and if you have a favorite object in the collection.
So my favorite artifacts that are on display, and I use the plural artifacts because there's more than one. It's a set that comes from the estate of Sheriff Lucius Amerson, and the objects on display include Sheriff Amerson's nameplate, his badge, and his sunglasses. And why I love them so much is because when I see them, I just imagine him getting ready for work in the morning, and that was how he started his day. That's how he prepared to go out into his community. And it's just like me. I have my routine. I stand next to the door on the way out, and I grab my wallet and my keys and my sunglasses. And to think that, we all go through these emotions to head off into the world and to experience what it is we're going to experience. And we need the things that we need in order to do that successfully, and to kind of create that identity. And for him to go out into his community as the first Black sheriff elected in the South since Reconstruction, had to have been one of the most challenging experiences for any law enforcement officer. And to think about how he started his day, put on my nameplate, get my badge, put on my sunglasses, and head out there and do what I'm supposed to do. And that to me is that's what's so incredible about everyday objects that we sometimes take for granted. And you put them in a museum and you put them on display and you create context for them. And that's how we learn, and that's how we connect to people. And that's how we as a community, learn about all the contributions people have made.
So we've talked about artifacts in the collection. We've talked about these stories from history. We talk about the experiences that people have in the museum today when they reflect on what service and sacrifice mean. But I would love to hear from you what you think the future looks like. Looking ahead, where do you think we're heading as an institution?
We're heading toward a place where law enforcement and the non-law enforcement community will see the museum and our organization as a place of education and a place where everybody can come to learn about law enforcement and the law enforcement field and the work that law enforcement officers do on a daily basis. And the reason I say that is because in large part, we get our information from news sources who are reporting on the news about events that happen in communities across the country, but we don't get a lot of information about how those officers are trained, the community service that those officers perform, and also just the breadth and depth of the law enforcement field. And that's through no one's fault. It's just we haven't yet had the institution in our country to be able to share that information. And so the museum's very new. We opened October of 2018. So we have a lot of room to grow and to become that institution for the United States. And that's where I'd like to see this organization start to lead, is in that conversation. We get a lot of education in our K through 12 system around lots of different subjects, but law enforcement and public safety isn't one that you have the opportunity to learn about in very many places. So again, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to be that place for people to seek opportunities to learn more about law enforcement and understand the profession a lot better than we do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Thomas. That's inspiring and hopeful, and I think really frames the important work that we aim to do here at the museum. I really appreciate your insight in giving us a view from the top and for taking some time with us today.
Thanks, Charles. It was my pleasure.
And now we would like to welcome Madison Scott to the podcast. Madison, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you all for having me.
Absolutely. Madison is the museum's manager of volunteer services, a crucial role within the museum. Madison, tell us a little bit more about your role at the museum.
Yeah, so like you said, I'm the manager of volunteer services. I'm lucky enough to work with our wonderful cohort of volunteers here at the museum. So I kind of oversee all of the volunteer side of the museum that we have here. So I oversee onboarding, recruitment, training. Our volunteers are who typically run our highlights tours here at the museum. So it's training them whether they're also helping with visitor services, working on the floor, engaging with visitors on a regular basis, running our activity carts, different things like that. I kind of oversee the training of all of our volunteers here, and it's a lot of fun getting to work with the diverse cohort that we have. It's pretty fun. A lot of them come from the law enforcement field, so kind of getting to hear about their experiences throughout training is pretty great, and watch them share those stories on the floor when they're engaging with visitors is pretty fun.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really special things that our museum can offer compared to others in this city of fantastic museums. It's that it's drawing on that law enforcement experience. And I know you've had so many conversations with onboarding new volunteers and hearing their stories. But I want to go back to one particular piece that you mentioned, which is the touring piece.
Mm-hmm.
That I know also, it becomes a big part of your responsibilities for the museum. What will visitors find when they come to the museum and take a highlights tour?
Yeah, so our highlights tour is the daily tour that we offer here at the museum on general admission days. Like I said, it's run by our museum guides who are active or retired law enforcement. Now at the museum at a time, we have about 800 objects on the floor on display. And that's quite a lot. And so we don't have the time to take visitors on a tour to every single object, obviously. So the highlights tour really gives kind of a broader overview of the themes within our museum. And it gives us a chance to highlight 5 to 6 objects and tell the specific story relating to that object, but also talk about those broader themes of American law enforcement. It's a very complex history, and so we kind of get to dive into that. And the great part about having our museum guides facilitate this experience is that coming from the law enforcement field, they have the opportunity to not only share these artifacts, but also share their personal stories that relate to the artifacts, which is a lot of fun watching. So like I said, the highlights tour, just highlighting a couple of our artifacts on the floor, not going to visit all 800, but we get to explore a lot of the very intricate and interesting topics related to American law enforcement, which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, I've seen our guides on the floor. I've seen you out on the floor presenting these tours, and it's a fantastic introduction to the museum.
Mm-hmm,
sort
sure.
of packs in the most information, the most engaging content in a reasonable amount of time. It's digestible. It's easy to experience. But I understand you have something else up your sleeve that you have been working on, we'll say a more involved tour, more of a specialty focus. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I've been working on a new tour for the museum to start offering. We'll begin offering it in October, and it's going to be a walking tour around Washington, D.C., which is a pretty unique experience for our visitors to have. The tour is called Presidential Assassinations and the Rise of Federal Law Enforcement. So this tour will probably be about 70 minutes, kind of depends on how much conversation we get into while on the tour. But we'll start at the museum, look at some artifacts related to presidential assassinations and how it impacted the FBI and Secret Service. And then from there, we'll leave the museum and take a walk around DC, stopping at 2 locations where these presidential assassinations took place. And we'll also just walk around discussing the way that these assassination attempts, both successful and unsuccessful, impacted federal law enforcement. So we'll go to FBI headquarters. We'll go to Ford's Theater. We'll talk about the way that they really shined a light onto what needed to change within federal law enforcement once these assassinations were completed. So it'll be a lot of fun. It's definitely a very unique opportunity. Other museums aren't really doing this in the area at the moment. And so I think it relates so well to what we have to offer within the museum that after the tour, visitors will be coming back in and continuing to look at those themes as they walk around our building.
That is really going to be awesome. I'm so excited to see that. Congratulations on all your hard work to bring that to life. I know it'll be a treat for visitors. I'm wondering in your research and your preparation for this tour if you have a favorite story, something that you've uncovered that you're sharing with the tour that maybe you can give us a little sneak peek inside the tour.
Yeah. So when talking about Abraham Lincoln and his assassination plot, obviously one of the key players was actor John Wilkes Booth. And one really interesting fact that I learned while doing research for this tour is that a DC socialite at the time, her name was Lucy Hale, happened to be dating both John Wilkes Booth and Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, at the same time. And it's said that the day of the assassination on April 14th, this woman, Lucy, met Robert Lincoln in the morning for Spanish lessons. I guess that's what you did together at the time in the 1860s.
Right.
And then later that afternoon went to lunch with John Wilkes Booth, who then later went that night to kill the president. And when Booth was found later at the barn in Virginia, after Union troops shot him and he passed away, they found a photo of Lucy in his breast pocket of his coat, and they had actually been secretly engaged. But it's just really interesting, this dynamic that this woman had between the assassinator of the president and his son. A lot of people, I think, don't really know that fact, and it was something very interesting that I uncovered. This just complex relationship that this woman had and how she met with them leading up to the assassination was just really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That is a new story to me as well. and I know that discussing things like that in the tour, in the places, on the streets near where these significant events happen, I think that can help bring that to life.
Definitely.
In a new way. That's cool. Thank you for sharing that. So when are these tours, these new special walking tours, and how do folks sign up?
Yeah, so we are offering 4 of these tours for the remainder of the year. The first one will be October 8th, then November 5th, November 19th, and December 3rd. So we're spreading them out kind of about every 2 weeks, beginning in October. And they'll be on Saturdays at 2 o'clock. Definitely reserve tickets early because we're only having 20 people per tour. But to find out more information and reserve your spot, you can check out our website under the events calendar. There's also an events page related to it as well that gives a little bit more background information and talks about each of the stops that we'll be going to.
Great. So listeners can go to lawenforcementmuseum.org, find all the details there for this exciting new touring opportunity. Madison, thank you.
Thank you. This is fun.
Thanks for sharing, and thanks for your work to offer some great experiences.
Yeah, for sure.
Now joining us in the podcast studio, we have Anna Muckenfoos, Manager of Programs and Educational Initiatives for the museum. Hey, Anna.
Hi. Happy to be here.
Thanks for coming by today. I am wondering if you can tell us about the museum's simulator program. I think this is just one of the coolest things we have here at the museum. What makes these simulator experiences at the museum unique in this city of great museums?
It's definitely something that really puts us on the map, is this simulator program. It's something that really no other museum in this area could really have in their exhibit and successfully market it in the way that we do. Or rather than market it, I should say utilize these kinds of systems the way that we use them in our exhibit. So a big part of the museum is trying to put the general public into the shoes of the average American law enforcement officer. So the use of force simulator, we have 5 simulator instructors who were all retired law enforcement. They actively served in law enforcement capacities in local, federal, and state agencies. So we have a good, well-rounded amount of experience there. But essentially we have this small feeder where the system that we use essentially uses a screen and actual Glock firearms, but all of the actual firearm components have been gutted. They're replaced with computer parts. Typically, 2 people are going to react to are going to actually actively participate with the scenarios rather than everybody in the room. But essentially, my instructor will kind of give some background about the history of law enforcement and then kind of the idea of the de-escalation of force that officers are trained to use, how officers are trained to use their firearms. But it's not all about just shooting and shooting for accuracy. It's about trying to de-escalate the situation so you don't have to use your firearm, so you don't have to use your less than lethal methods of force. And so my instructors will they'll describe that, and then they'll also go on to kind of explain that to the visitor, and then they'll invite usually 2 participants down to actually interact with the scenario. The instructor, along with The audience will watch them react to the scenario and then kind of debrief how the realities of how a law enforcement officer would react to that scenario rather than how the member of the general public did. So it's kind of a good way to start those conversations and really break down those misconceptions that we have about law enforcement use of force and de-escalation practices. And we've been able to have a lot of those really good conversations within the simulator. And it's been one of the most successful programs here at the museum from our inception. It's been so successful that we've added a driving simulator to our program as well. During the pandemic, we brought in the L3 Harris Patrol Sim. It's been a really interesting experience, especially bringing in like high schoolers, younger drivers as well. It's a good way to kind of talk about the differences between driving as a civilian and driving as a law enforcement officer. It's about trying to get home at the end of the day and be safer as law enforcement officers for themselves, but also for their communities, because just the way that the officer drives can help to make the community safer. Overall, the majority of line of duty deaths happen because of traffic stops, happen on the road. So it's been kind of a good way to tie that statistic from the memorial into this program as well.
Yeah, and that's a really great connection to the larger work of our organization.
Mm-hmm.
In our Lifeline episodes here on the podcast, we also are taking a look inside the National Traffic Safety Summit.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's looking at those questions of roadway safety for professionals in the field of law enforcement and cultivating a culture of safety. And we're able to help general visitors understand a little bit of that, a little bit of that too. You know, I think with both of these simulator experiences, what I found so enlightening is how easy it is to make assumptions about the work that officers do. And when suddenly you're faced with a scenario or you're behind the wheel and you realize, oh, my mind has to be racing 1,000 miles a minute to consider every possible outcome and scenario. And I love that we're able to help visitors understand that and offer something unique. Now, for visitors who want to go deeper, just as the simulators help them better understand content and experiences, I know some groups, schools, community organizations, can come to the museum and book educational workshops.
Yes.
And one of your hats is working with those. So I was wondering if you could take just a second and let us know what's available for groups who come to the museum who want those additional educational experiences.
Yeah, so a big part of why I got into working in museums in the first place is because I really enjoyed going to museums and for field trips and participating in workshops, participating in additional activities when the museums were open for the general public. And so the workshops have kind of been my real niche while I've been here at the museum. And we offer quite a good variety of programs. Most of them do focus on forensic science. Forensic science is a very popular topic, and it's something that you really need to do hands-on activities to really, really grasp its concepts. And they're kind of interesting concepts to work with in a group setting. So we host 2 more traditional classroom workshops. They are CSI Crash Course, I believe is the name of it, CSI Crash Course and Forensic Pathology. So CSI Crash Course kind of talks about the basics of forensic science. We go through fingerprints, DNA, some of those more traditional areas of forensic science and proper evidence collection techniques. So when you're faced with a crime scene, how are CSIs going to make sure that they're not contaminating the scene with their own DNA, with their own materials? So because we shed DNA just by walking around, think about brushing your hair and all the hair that ends up in your hairbrush, even when you're healthy without trying, that happens all day long. And so how do we make sure that your CSI doesn't shed hair in a crime scene and their hair be picked up as evidence? How kind of talking about those best practices and giving it that career connection. But then our overwhelmingly most popular workshop is going to be forensic pathology. Everybody's seen shows like CSI and Law and Order. NCIS where they're in the autopsy suite and they're talking about their victim and, you know, all of the injuries that they have. We kind of break down some of those myths about forensic pathology, but then also talk about the autopsy procedure, talk about what that looks like. Forensic pathology is obviously a far wider field than just the medical examiner's office, just the autopsy suite, but it's really the one that's hardest to teach in a traditional classroom setting. And one of the best parts about being a museum educator, having these kinds of workshops at a museum, is we can do things that teachers may not have the ability to do in their traditional classroom with limited budgets, limited resources. And so we can provide that for their students and get them kind of out of their regular environment to have those kinds of experiences. And I think forensic pathology is one of my favorite workshops to teach too. I've always found the field very interesting. So it's kind of fun to be able to get into it and teach it. But we also have workshops, true crime scavenger hunts. This is another I host Law and Disorder on Precinct 444. So true crime is something that I'm passionate about, something that is very interesting to me. And it's in our Take the Case exhibit, we have some evidence from notable cases that have made a big impact on law enforcement history. And so we have kind of taken some of those cases from that exhibit, but also from pieces of our collection and things of that nature to create these scavenger hunts that take students or adults through the museum exhibit, solving some clues to get some information about a historic case. So they work from the beginning. The first clue corresponds with the beginning of the case, moves them through the entirety of the case, and then once they break all of their locks, kind of like an escape room scavenger hunt type of situation, then they get their verdict. So it's kind of a fun team building activity, but really gives them time in the exhibit, but with a greater purpose than just exploring on their own. So they get to experience the exhibit kind of in the context of this historic case. So we have two available right now. We have the Charles Lindbergh Jr. kidnapping and the O.J. Simpson case. So it's something that is it's historical. It kind of blends our exhibits into the context of a greater frame of history, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, and I like that those scavenger hunts are also something that we sometimes see adult groups coming in for sort of team building activities. It's not
I get a lot of professional groups that book they book the scavenger hunt as a way to kind of have fun and learn something new, but also work together as a team, which is kind of neat.
Yeah, yeah, those are great
and
fun.
They have just as much fun as the high school kids that do it. So maybe even more, because they're not worried about being judged by their friends so deeply. But it's kind of fun to watch everybody kind of enjoy those. So.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned one of our other podcast series as well. Mm-hmm. I was just about to toot your horn for that. Anna is the voice of Law and Disorder, bringing us a look at true crime. Her research and storytelling skills are on full display with that great series, which drops the last Wednesday of every month. Thank you for your work with that and for your ongoing educational management for the museum and for taking some time with us today.
Yes, of course. And we've got some good topics coming up for the rest of Law and Disorder, the rest of this season. So I'm excited to kind of bring those out as well. So
great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anna.
Of course.
And now we are joined by Christopher Mitchell, Manager of Digital Content and Strategy for the museum. Chris is normally behind the scenes helping bring this podcast to life, but he also has his hand in the collections realm of the museum. Chris, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Charles.
Absolutely. When we talk about collections where a museum is concerned, what does that actually mean?
I think in the simplest terms, you can probably just say preservation and conservation. And at least from a preservation standpoint, it's all about housing objects and keeping them in the best condition they can be kept in while they're not on display. And even when they're on display, obviously we keep them in closed cases and monitor humidity and temperature levels. And, collections is very much about just holding on to the objects until we're ready to use them.
Right. Right. Yeah, I was just describing to somebody the other day that the stuff of the museum is not just an exhibit that you see, but when somebody donates objects to the museum, it's just as you said, it's the preservation, it's the caring for them so that they'll last for time as we try to tell the story of American law enforcement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think even for like the layman, when they hear museum, they just think of stuff. They think of old objects. They think of preserving objects and the things that are not seen in a museum, that are kept behind closed doors. It's, they're cared for in much of the same way.
Sure. So I understand right now, Chris, you've got a big project you're helping out with, deinstalling our first ever special temporary exhibition. So I have two questions for you. First of all, what was the exhibit? And secondly, what does deinstalling mean?
Yeah, so I'm working on deinstalling post 9/11, the evolution of American law enforcement. We're about a couple weeks away from that. And as the title suggests, it's how American law enforcement has evolved since the September 11th attacks more than 20 years ago. And we look at a couple of case studies in there, and we don't really get into the nitty-gritty details of the events of that day. As you walk through the exhibit, or as you would have walked through the exhibit, you would have kind of heard some things, and you would have seen some images of that day with some banners and graphics of people that were involved in the timeline. And then it would have quickly moved into new legislation and terrorist attacks that occurred after the September 11th attacks, and how law enforcement has since responded to those type of events, as opposed to maybe how they would have responded to them pre 9/11. And that's where we wanted to get at, because we wanted to see the gradual and almost immediate evolution and adaptation of law enforcement as they approach new and I'd say disturbing cases of terrorist attacks, domestic terrorist attacks in the United States.
It was a gripping and very engaging exhibit. So tell me about deinstallation, what that actually means, and how that process is going for you.
Well, sure. So the installing an exhibit is exactly like it sounds, and it's when you're actually putting things in a specific space, and that can be any kind of variety of multimedia objects or items. And in this case, we had oral histories, and we had video and audio, and some interactive components of it. So really the deinstall part of that is just removing those objects. So for me, I handled the collection side of things, so I'm in charge of removing the objects from the exhibit and then putting those in our on-site temporary collection storage area. And objects that were given to us on loan, those are then repackaged and then shipped back or picked up by the organizations that lent us those objects.
Okay, great. So I know that the exhibit closed to the public in early October. Have listeners missed the chance to see what this exhibit looked like?
No, they have not. So on top of the exhibit itself, there was also a couple of programs that were kind of woven in and around the exhibit itself. And I also created a video, a sort of walkthrough of sorts. So people can check that out on YouTube. The link to that is in the description of this specific episode.
It's so nice that with the digital content that you manage for the museum, that we're able to take our experiences and our programs out to the world, people who are not able to visit us on site here at the museum. I know I have very fond memories of our collaborations on some of these programs, especially high in my mind is a program that we did on the 40th anniversary of the crash of Air Florida Flight 90, which was a huge event here in the DC area from January 1982. And the public program that you and I put together was an amazing video that included interviews with people involved in that incident, some footage we recorded at the aviation hangar for the U.S. Park Police, and then you and I had a very special treat of going up in the air
That we did.
with the U.S. Park Police for a very rare flyover of D.C. and retracing the flight involved in the rescue of Air Florida Flight 90. So if folks go online to look for that post 9/11 content, they've got a lot of other opportunities to engage with our content and our resources online.
Exactly. And, as my title suggests, I'm very much into the digital experience and digital realm of broadening our footprint online. And, what we offer here at the museum is excellent and it's great, but I tried to package that and put it online so people that can't come to the museum can certainly go on YouTube or on our website and find some of the same content that we have here in the museum.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for all your efforts on that front and for taking some time with us today, Chris.
Absolutely, Charles. Loved it.
So there we go. Our first museum spotlight, shining a light on the life and activities of the National Law Enforcement Museum. Thanks to my colleagues Thomas Canavan, Madison Scott, Anna Muckenfoos, and Christopher Mitchell for taking time out of their busy schedules to sit and chat. There's a lot happening at the museum, from our collections on site to tours to stories to online programming. We, of course, hope to see you on site, but no matter where you are, you can engage the life and mission of the museum. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. And we would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.